The farmer's days were carved from silence, plowing fields no one visited, eating meals with no voice to answer back. Loneliness had become his shadow, steady and cold. But one evening, as the town gathered for an auction more cruel than any gallows, he saw her, the last Apache woman they had left behind, her wrists bound, her eyes defiant even in chains. The crowd treated her as property, a prize to be won. He raised his hand not for desire, not for pride, but for reasons he himself could not name. When the gavel struck, the town smirked. The man who lived alone would no longer be alone, though what he'd purchased was no companion, but a storm. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wagon creaked beneath the fading light of dusk, its wheels cutting shallow ruts through the hard-packed road that led away from the town's leering faces and into the long loneliness of the prairie. And though the rope that had bound her wrists now lay cut upon the wagon boards, she did not falter, did not stumble, but walked beside him with a stride that carried no hint of defeat, her back straight, her chin high, her dark eyes steady on the horizon as though the chain of gazes that had shackled her in the auction yard had never touched her spirit. He kept his place at the wagon's reins, shoulders tight, jaw set, trying not to look at her but failing, for every glance only deepened the ache in his chest. That gnawing confusion at why his hand had gone up when the gavel fell, why he had opened his purse when his heart had cried out against it, why he had chosen to carry home not a companion nor a servant, but a storm bound in human form. The townsfolk's smirks still burned in his mind, their whispers trailing after him like burrs clinging to wool. The lonely farmer bought himself company now, yet the weight he carried was no man's jest, but a burden he could not name, a shadow of guilt and duty tangled with something fiercer, something he dared not call hope. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm, and in that silence between them, broken only by the cry of a distant hawk and the groan of leather harness, he felt every inch the fool, for here was a woman robbed of her people, stripped of her freedom, and yet she bore herself with a pride that made her seem taller than the wagon itself, her gaze never lowering, her silence sharper than any blade, and he wondered if he had saved her or stolen her, if he had bought her life or bound it anew. The prairie wind tugged at his coat and at her hair, black strands whipping free to catch the last glimmer of the sun, and he found himself stealing glances when he thought she would not notice, searching her face for anger, for fear, for anything that might give him answer. But all he found was that unbroken defiance, the same fire that had made the crowd uneasy even as they laughed. His hands tightened on the reins until the leather bit his palms, for the truth gnawed at him that he had no plan, no reason he could voice, only the strange pull that had moved him in that moment, and now he bore the weight of it in the hollow silence stretching between them, a silence that felt as vast as the prairie itself. The road wound on, each mile carrying them further from town and deeper into the solitude he had once thought his shield, and with each step of her unyielding stride he felt that solitude shifting, no longer the balm it had been but a fragile shell already cracking beneath the storm he had brought upon himself. And though he did not yet know if he had doomed them both or planted the seed of something neither of them could name, he knew with a certainty that made his breath tight that his days of silence were gone, replaced by a presence that would not be tamed, a woman who walked unchained beside his wagon, proud and unbroken, her very shadow demanding an answer he did not yet possess. The cabin squatted low against the prairie wind, a shape of timber and stone that had once felt like a refuge, but now seemed far too small for the storm he had brought within its walls. And as he swung the heavy door wide to let her in, the warmth of the hearth spilled across the threshold, carrying the sense of smoke and stew that had so long been wasted on only himself. She stepped inside without hesitation, her posture proud though her bare feet left faint prints of dust upon the worn boards, and he felt his throat tighten as he watched her eyes move not hungrily toward the table he had set with bread and beans, but searching every shadow, every corner, each exit and window with a sharpness that spoke of a life lived too long among enemies. Her silence stretched taut like a bowstring, making every creak of timber echo louder than it had ever sounded before. He busied himself at the hearth, ladling stew into a wooden bowl and sliding bread onto a plate, his hands clumsy as though he had forgotten the simple rhythm of hospitality. And when at last he placed the meal before her, she did not thank him with words but with a single glance, measured and cool, before lowering herself cross-legged upon the bench and beginning to eat, each motion deliberate, her fingers steady, her jaw working as if every bite were taken not from hunger alone but from the resolve to show she could not be broken even by kindness. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them, mingling with the soft scrape of her spoon against the bowl, and he sat opposite her, his own meal untouched, studying the way her eyes flickered constantly, not in fear, not even in suspicion, but in vigilance, scanning the shadows as though expecting danger to step from them at any moment. And in that quiet scrutiny he realized how loud his home had become, every creak of the rafters, every sigh of the wind, every small pop of sap in the fire made strange and alive by her presence, humming with a tension that had never existed when it was only him. He remembered how the house had once been smothered in silence, the kind that weighed like a coffin, meals eaten with only his own thoughts for company, nights passed listening to the lonely song of coyotes, days spent plowing fields that fed no one's gratitude but his own, and though he had grown used to it, had convinced himself that solitude was a shield. Tonight he felt that silence shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced by the invisible hum of a stranger's guarded breath, the soft clink of a spoon, the steady scrape of her boot against the floor, and he knew with a certainty that startled him that his cabin, once empty as the sky itself, would never be the same. She finished at last, setting the bowl down without comment, her eyes meeting his across the table in a gaze that held no gratitude, no surrender, only a wordless declaration that she remained her own, bound to no man even here, and in that moment he felt the weight of what he had done settle deeper than ever before he had brought her here to end his loneliness. Yet what filled the cabin now was not companionship but a tension sharp enough to cut, a silence alive with unspoken truths, and though he did not understand it, though he could not name the force that had driven him to raise his hand at the auction, he knew as he stared into her unyielding eyes that the quiet life he had once clung to was gone forever. The town's main street, always a crooked spine of dust and weather-beaten facades, seemed sharper now beneath the weight of eyes that followed him wherever he led his wagon. The woman walking beside it with her head high, her wrists free but her spirit bound in the judgment of every gaze. The whispers began as murmurs at the saloon porch, the quick smothered chuckles of men who leaned on their rifles and spat tobacco into the dirt, mocking the lonely farmer who had bought himself a storm, their voices carrying just loud enough for him to hear, "She'll cut his throat before spring. You mark it," and though he kept his jaw clenched and his eyes forward, each word struck like a pebble against glass, small but unrelenting, wearing away at whatever certainty he had tried to carve from his choice. The women, gathered by the general store in their shawls, offered no kindness either, their sneers sharper than the men's laughter, their tongues laced with venom. He'd sooner have chained a wolf than brought her under his roof, and their children, wild as the prairie wind, darted from doorways to mock with cruel mimicry, tugging at imaginary chains or howling like savages, until their mothers dragged them back with half-hearted scolds, leaving behind the echo of their taunts. Elijah felt the shame burn in his chest, but it was not for himself alone. He glanced sideways at her, at the woman who bore the jeers without flinching, her gaze fixed beyond the street, her silence unyielding as though every insult was no more than dust on her skin. And that unbroken pride stung him more than the words, for it reminded him that she had survived far worse than gossip, that she had seen her people stripped from the earth and still stood tall, while he, a man who had known only solitude, was already bending beneath the weight of whispers. The air grew thick with suspicion, thicker with each passing day, for men who once tipped their hats to him now crossed the street, and voices lowered when he entered the blacksmith's or lingered at the mercantile, mutters weaving dark predictions of how long he would last before her knife found him in his sleep, and he knew the sound of malice when he heard it, the shift of suspicion hardening into something uglier, something that could fester into action if given time. Yet she gave them nothing to feed on, no word, no glance, no sign of submission or rebellion, only that steady defiance that turned their fear into hatred. And in the quiet of his nights, when the fire burned low and her eyes gleamed watchful across the cabin's dim glow, Elijah wondered if the whispers might be right, if the storm he had brought home would one day turn on him, if he would wake with her shadow looming, her knife glinting, the town's jeers fulfilled in blood. But still, when dawn came and he harnessed the horse, she walked beside the wagon with her head unbowed, And though suspicion clung to him like a second skin, a darker part of him almost admired her silence, for it cut deeper than any words she could have spoken, leaving him to wrestle alone with the truth that the storm had already changed him, that the quiet life he once knew was gone not because of her blade, but because of her unshaken gaze that refused to be conquered by chains or whispers, and the malice of the town was only the echo of the turmoil already brewing in his own chest. The days bled together beneath the wide, pitiless sky, each sunrise spilling across the prairie like fire, each dusk dropping its weight of silence upon the cabin, and in that rhythm the farmer found himself no longer alone in the fields but matched stride for stride by the woman who had once stood in chains, her hands as calloused as his, her back bent against the plow with a strength that startled him each time he glanced her way, where he had once toiled slow and solitary, breaking the stubborn earth with weary patience. Now the furrows stretched longer, straighter, the soil turned deeper under the weight of two bodies instead of one, her endurance carrying them beyond the limits of his own flesh. For when his arms trembled with fatigue and sweat blurred his vision, she pressed on without pause, her motion steady, her jaw set, her dark eyes locked on the horizon, as if the land itself dared her to yield, and she refused. The horse that strained at the harness seemed to sense the difference too, working smoother, steadier, as though the presence of her hands at the reins carried some unspoken command. And by the second week Elijah could see the change in the fields, the stubborn earth giving up more than it ever had beneath his lone labor, the rows straight, the seeds buried true, the promise of harvest thicker than he had thought possible in such dry soil. Yet for all their sweat mingling in the dirt, their words remained scarce, exchanged only in necessity: water, rope, lift, spoken in tones stripped bare of warmth, and he wondered if she guarded her silence out of pride, or if her tongue simply had no place for the language of a man she had not chosen. Still, there were moments when the air between them seemed to hum with something more than labor. Fleeting sparks struck when their hands brushed passing the hoe, when their shoulders grazed beneath the yoke of water buckets, when her eyes, dark as the tilled soil, met his across the field and held for a heartbeat before breaking away. At night, when the lamp burned low and their bodies ached from the day's toil, the cabin walls seemed to listen to their silence, heavier now, but not as empty as it had once been. For where solitude had once pressed against him like stone, now her presence filled the space with an energy he could not name. A storm held at bay but never gone, and he found himself lying awake listening for the cadence of her breath, proof that she was still there, still unbroken, still working beside him when dawn came again. He told himself it was only the land he cared for, only the harvest that stirred his restless nights, that her strength was no more than a tool he had been wise enough to secure. But deep down he knew it was more. For the land was yielding not just grain beneath their sweat, but something else between them, something fragile and wordless. A seed not yet sprouted but alive in the soil of their shared labor, and though neither of them would speak it, though silence still cloaked them as surely as the prairie wind, Elijah felt it growing with every furrow turned, every bucket hauled, every breath stolen from the same long days beneath the same endless Sunday. The prairie night stretched wide and brittle, stars scattered sharp across the heavens like shards of flint. The only sounds the low whistle of wind against the shutters and the tired creak of timbers settling into silence, when Elijah Rawley, half dozing on his cot with the day's labor still aching in his bones, heard a sound so soft it might have been the ghost of the storm, her voice, low and trembling, words spilling in a cadence not his own, the language rough and fluid like water over stones, each syllable carved with sorrow too deep for translation. He froze, breath caught in his chest, for he had never heard her speak more than the few clipped words necessary to toil beside him. And now, as he lay still, he realized she was not speaking to him at all but to something far older. A prayer whispered into the darkness, her tone cracked with grief, calling on spirits or ancestors long buried, mourning for the tribe the town had stripped from her, for kin whose bones lay in shallow earth, for a life stolen and never returned. And the sound of it pierced him in a way no jeer from town, no whisper of gossip ever had. Her voice broke once, a sharp catch in the throat that wrenched the air from his lungs, and he saw in his mind not the proud woman striding beside his wagon nor the tireless worker breaking earth in the fields, but a mother, a daughter, a wife perhaps, carrying ghosts in her chest so heavy they bent her in the quiet of the night where no one was meant to see. He turned his face into the pillow, willing himself not to listen, telling himself it was none of his concern, that sympathy was a fool's road leading to betrayal. Yet the longer her voice wove its lament, the more he felt the old hardness in him born from years of silence, of loneliness, of bitter suspicion begin to crack, hairline fractures spreading where her grief seeped in like water, wearing down the walls he had built. His hands clenched against the blanket, fighting the pull of compassion, cursing himself for weakness. For in his memory still burned the sight of his brother's blood spilled by Apaches, the faces of neighbors lost to raids, and he told himself that to pity her was to betray the dead, that her sorrow was not his to bear. Yet even as the bitterness rose, the sound of her prayer twisted it, reshaped it, until what he felt was no longer rage, but the terrible ache of recognition, the understanding that grief was the one language that needed no translation, that in her cracked whispers he heard his own losses echoing back at him, his own silence mirrored in hers. When her voice finally fell quiet, swallowed by the wind, the cabin seemed emptier than it had in years, and Elijah lay staring at the ceiling, his heart hammering, knowing that something in him had shifted against his will, that the shell he had wrapped around himself for so long was no longer whole, and though he resisted the sympathy clawing its way up through the cracks, he could not smother it entirely. For her sorrow had bound itself to his in the dark, silent and unseen, yet unshakable as the prairie itself. The saloon reeked of spilled whiskey and stale smoke, its lamplight throwing long shadows across warped floorboards where boots scuffed and spurs jingled. And Elijah Rawley, stopping only for supplies and a swallow of bourbon to chase the dust from his throat, found himself hemmed in before he could set his glass down, three broad men sliding from their stools like wolves circling a lone steer, their eyes gleaming with a malice sharpened by drink, and something darker hate left to rot too long in the gut. The biggest of them leaned close, his breath sour, his grin wide enough to show the gaps where fists or rifle butts had claimed teeth, and his words came low but carried across the room like a pistol cocking. "Best keep your savage on a leash, farmer, for she bites off more than you can hold." The others chuckled, cruel and eager, their shoulders blocking his retreat, and Elijah's stomach tightened, for he heard in their tone not idle mockery but the tremor of violence itching to spill, the kind of venom that never slept, that would not be sated by whispers or jeers but only by blood. He gripped his glass tighter than he meant to, jaw locked, the old instinct to swing first burning through his arms, but he forced his body still, knowing that one rash move in a den like this could bring half the room against him, for it was not just these three who hated what he had done, but the whole town simmering with suspicion, each whisper at the blacksmiths, each sneer at the mercantile, feeding into this moment like kindling waiting for flame. His silence only widened their grins, and one jabbed a thick finger into his chest, repeating the slur with a sneer, "Leash her, farmer, or we'll do it for you." The words hit harder than the finger, not because of their threat against him but because of the way they spat her humanity aside, reducing her to something less than a dog, less than even the storm they feared. And rage flared in him before he could smother it, hot and sudden, startling in its strength. He saw her face in his mind, proud and unbroken even in chains, the same pride she carried still as she worked the fields beside him, and the thought of these men speaking of her as property, as a beast to be broken, made his blood thunder in his ears until the room blurred at the edges. Yet he held himself steady, gripping the bar with one hand while the other hovered near the knife at his belt, for he understood what boiled here was not a passing quarrel but a storm gathering weight, a storm that would break not in words but in fists, knives, and gunfire if he was not careful. And though part of him yearned to strike, to silence their jeers with blood, he forced his breath calm, gave no answer but a glare sharp enough to cut, until at last they drew back with mocking laughs, their boots thudding across the boards as they swaggered out into the night, leaving their words hanging in the smoky air like a curse. Elijah drained his glass in a single swallow, his hands trembling not with fear but with the realization that this hatred was not done with him, that it lived and grew in the town like a sickness, and though no blows had fallen yet, he knew with bone-deep certainty that the storm was coming, and when it broke, it would not stop until it swallowed them all. The dawn broke, not with birdsong but with the crackling roar of fire, a sound Elijah Rawley first mistook for the wind until the acrid sting of smoke hit his throat and he stumbled from the cabin to see the horizon aflame. His fields, those long furrows carved with sweat and silence licked by fire that raced hungrily across the dry stalks, red tongues leaping higher than any torch could throw. For a heartbeat he froze, gut hollowed by the sight of his harvest, his very survival, turning to ash before his eyes. But then her cry split the air sharp, commanding, and the woman was already moving, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her hands seizing the water buckets before he could shake himself from despair, and together they charged into the inferno as though they might wrestle the very wrath of God. The smoke clawed at his lungs, the heat blistered his skin, the flames snapped like whips at his arms, yet still they fought, beating back the fire with wet sacks, dousing what they could, stamping out embers until their boots smoldered. And all the while she moved with a fury that startled him, unyielding where he faltered, her arms strong as iron, her voice a harsh rhythm driving him on here, now there, faster, and for the first time since he had brought her from the town, he followed without hesitation, no longer the master of his fields but her equal in struggle, bound not by silence but by the desperate unity of survival. The flames roared like beasts, leaping from row to row, and the wind drove sparks into their hair, their clothes, until Elijah's hands blistered raw from slapping at fire, his eyes streaming with smoke. Yet whenever his strength faltered, he saw her silhouette through the haze, unbowed, her body bent to the work with the relentless will of someone who had already lost too much to lose again, and he felt himself steadied by her, pulled forward through the choking blackness by the sheer defiance of her presence. Together they carved a line against the blaze, a ragged border of damp earth and trampled fire that held at last, the flames sputtering where their buckets fell, the smoke thinning until only charred stalks and glowing embers remained, and they collapsed side by side in the blackened dirt, their bodies trembling, their lungs raw, the dawn's light bleeding gold across a field half destroyed yet not conquered. Elijah lay there, staring at the woman whose face was streaked with soot, whose breath tore ragged from her chest, and he saw her not as the burden the town had mocked him for buying, not as the storm he had feared to unleash, but as survival itself, as the iron that had held him upright when despair threatened to drag him down. And though no words passed between them, though the silence still pressed heavy, it no longer felt empty, no longer felt like a gulf, but like a bridge built in fire and smoke, binding them in a way he had never expected. The town's hatred had come like a spark, its vengeance burning through his life, but it had failed to consume them, and as he looked upon her proud even in ruin, unbroken even in ash, Elijah realized with a clarity sharp as the morning air that the storm he had brought home was no curse but the very reason he still drew breath. The smoke had barely lifted from the charred remains of the fields when Elijah took to clearing what could be salvaged, boots crunching over blackened stalks and brittle ash, but it was she who knelt first in the ruin, her soot-streaked hands digging through the debris with a focus that stilled him, until at last she lifted something small from the dirt, a ragged scrap of cloth, its color faded by sun and fire, the limp arm of a doll half-burned and half-buried. Its stitched smile melted to a grimace. For a long moment she only stared at it, her dark eyes fixed as though she were staring down a ghost, her fingers trembling despite the strength that had carried her through the flames, and Elijah, watching from a few steps away, felt the air between them tighten with something heavier than smoke, a silence that seemed to pulse with grief. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the clipped syllables he had grown used to, nor the sharp commands that had driven them through the fire, but a low murmur in her own tongue, words wrapped in sorrow that bled into English as if the burden of them demanded he understand. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking like brittle wood. She had one like this. They came in the night, the riders, with guns and fire. She was small, she was running, and her throat closed, the rest torn away by memory. And for the first time since he had known her, Elijah saw her pride falter, saw the steel of her silence bend beneath the weight of a wound too deep to hide. She pressed the doll to her chest, her eyes fixed not on him but on the horizon where the desert stretched endless and merciless, and she told him of that night, the raid that had left her tribe broken, the gunfire that scattered her people, the smoke that filled the air just as it had filled these fields, the moment she had reached for her daughter's hand and found only emptiness, the cruel knowledge that the desert swallowed children as swiftly as fire swallowed crops. Her voice trembled once, then steadied, not with peace but with the iron of someone who had carried grief so long it had hardened into armor, and Elijah, listening, felt his chest tighten as though her loss carved into him as well, for he knew too well the hollow left by family torn away, knew how loneliness could rot a man from the inside until nothing remained but silence. He wanted to speak, to offer something comfort, promise, even prayer, but the words tangled useless on his tongue, and in their place he only stepped closer, his shadow falling across her where she knelt, a quiet presence he hoped might be enough. She looked at him then, just once, her eyes wet but fierce, as if daring him to turn away, to treat her sorrow as weakness, and when he did not flinch, when he only met her gaze with a grief of his own, she turned back to the doll and set it gently upon the ruined earth, a relic of both what she had lost and what she would not allow to be forgotten. The wind stirred the ashes, carrying the faint smell of smoke into the rising day, and in that fragile silence Elijah understood that what bound them now was not the purchase made in the town square, not the whispers or the malice of others, but the shared weight of ghosts, of futures burned away, of children who would never come home. And for the first time he saw her not as storm nor shadow, but as a mother with a wound no fire could ever consume. The prairie night trembled with the distant thunder of hooves, a low rumble that grew into the drunken roar of voices, the clatter of bottles, the jangling of spurs, and by the time Elijah Rawley stepped to his doorway with rifle in hand, the moonlight already caught the glint of iron and the sway of torches as a mob spilled across the flats toward his cabin, their shouts twisting the air with venom. Finish what the auction should have, burn 'em out, cut her down. And he felt the marrow of his bones chill, not with fear for himself but with the terrible certainty that the storm had finally broken, that the whispers in town, the threats in the saloon, the fire in his fields had all been but sparks leading to this night of reckoning. The cabin loomed behind him, fragile as a matchstick against the tide rolling closer, and for a moment he tasted despair, knowing no wood or stone could stand long against men drunk on hate. But before it could swallow him, he felt a presence at his side, and there she was, tall, unyielding, her face lit by the wavering glow of torchlight, her eyes dark as storm clouds, her hands empty but her stance fierce, and she needed no weapon to look like a warrior carved from the earth itself. She did not speak, but she did not need to, for the weight of her silence pressed steady against him, anchoring his fear. And in that moment, Elijah realized the choice he had avoided for so long was upon him, to stand with her, or to let the mob claim her as they always intended. His grip tightened on the rifle, its stock worn smooth by years of lonely labor, now feeling heavier than it ever had, and as the riders drew close, he stepped forward, boots firm in the dirt, raising the barrel high enough for its shape to catch the firelight. A wordless declaration that he would not step aside. The mob reined in short of the cabin, their horses restless, the men shouting curses, spitting oaths, their eyes gleaming with the fever of those who believed themselves righteous in cruelty. And though the numbers dwarfed him, though the odds mocked him, Elijah felt something steal through his chest, for he was no longer standing alone, no longer staring down the storm with only silence for company. She was beside him, her shadow stretching tall across the doorway, her presence fierce enough to make even the boldest rider hesitate. The night seemed to hold its breath, the flames of their torches whipping in the wind, and Elijah's voice, raw from smoke and dust, rose above the clamor, not loud but steady. This is my land. She is under my roof. You'll not take her while I draw breath. The words silenced some, enraged others, but all knew he meant them, for his stance was not of a man bluffing for pride, but of one ready to die. And the mob, sensing it, shifted uneasily, the first fissures of doubt cracking through their drunken bravado. She moved then, slow and deliberate, placing her hand upon the barrel of his rifle, lowering it just a fraction, and the gesture, quiet and unspoken, told him that whatever came, they would face it side by side, storm against storm, and as the mob gathered itself for the charge, Elijah felt no loneliness, no hollow in his chest, only the fierce clarity that the reckoning had come, and he was ready to meet it with her unbroken beside him. The night exploded in firelight and fury, the mob surging like a tide of hate against the small cabin on the prairie, rifles cracking, torches hurled to shatter against the walls, horses screaming as men shouted their drunken oaths. But Elijah Rawley stood fast at the doorway, his rifle spitting flame into the dark, each shot deliberate, measured, driven not by anger but by the grim knowledge that if he faltered now, all he had left would be swallowed whole. Beside him she moved with a swiftness that made her seem larger than life, seizing a fallen torch and hurling it back into the fray, dragging a man from his saddle with her bare hands and sending him crashing into the dirt, her voice rising in a raw cry that split the night, the sound of a woman who had lost everything once and would not lose again. Smoke billowed through the air, sparks drifting like fireflies across the field, and Elijah's world narrowed to the pounding of his heart, the recoil of the rifle, the fierce silhouette of her form moving through chaos like a storm-given flesh. And though blood slicked his hands and sweat blinded his eyes, he felt stronger than he ever had, bound not by solitude but by her presence, her defiance feeding his will. The mob, so brave in drink and numbers, began to falter as bodies fell, as the fire they had meant to consume the cabin licked instead at their own fear, and soon the line of riders broke apart, scattering into the night with curses and vows that melted useless in the wind, leaving behind only the groans of the wounded and the acrid stink of powder and ash. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of dying flames and the ragged sound of breath pulled from smoke-scorched lungs. And Elijah, lowering his rifle, felt his knees weaken as the weight of what they had done crashed upon him. The soil beneath his boots stained with blood, the homestead still standing though scarred. The dawn's first pale light creeping over the horizon, as if the world itself were cautious to return. He turned to her then, his chest heaving, his hands trembling not from fear but from the raw enormity of survival. And in her face he saw the soot, the sweat, the blood, but more than that he saw the unbroken pride that had carried her from the auction block to this moment, her eyes steady as the earth itself. And when she spoke it was not in gratitude, not in surrender, but in truth, sharp as a blade. "You didn't buy me. You chose me." The words cut through the smoke, through the years of silence that had hollowed him, filling the space inside his chest with something that felt almost unbearable in its weight relief. Belonging, the dawning ache of hope, and for the first time since he could remember, Elijah felt the silence within him breaking, not shattered by loneliness but opened by choice, by the bond forged in fire and blood, by the woman beside him who was no longer storm nor burden nor stranger but the answer he had never known he sought. And as the sun rose slow and steady over the wounded fields, casting its light across the scars of the night, he stood with her in the doorway of the cabin, the hollow years behind him fading like smoke, the horizon before them alive with the fragile, perilous promise of something new.